Check one, two, three. Hey everybody, it's Michael Helms, also known as Michael the Sound Guy, and this is the Location Sound Podcast. You know, each episode we talk with location sound mixers, boom ops, and other industry pros about the various aspects of recording sound on location, whether it's for feature and independent films, TV commercials, interviews, any time where dialogue from actors is recorded. I started my career in the recording studios in New York City with some of the big artists back in the day, and later on projects for networks like HBO, Sci-Fi Channel, and the Cartoon Network. As time went by, I got out of the studio and began working in production sound. Whether you're a seasoned veteran or just starting out, thanks for joining us. Okay, my guest today has experience on all kinds of shoots, from run-and-gun documentaries and indie features to high-end short films and commercials. He's a freelance production sound mixer and boom op based out of the Washington, D.C. area. Please welcome Ted Hogeman.
Hi.
Good to have you on the podcast, Ted.
Well, happy to be here.
All right, Ted, let's jump in and talk about an overview of what's in your audio bag.
Yeah, so right before COVID, I upgraded to the Sound Devices 833 mixer recorder. I had previously been on a Sound Devices 633, and I've got a very eclectic mix of Lectrosonics wireless. So the rundown is Lectrosonics SRB and SRC, a couple of 411s, and then two LR receivers, and then I pair those with another full range of Lectros, two SMQVs, two LTs, an SMA, an SM, and a UH400. So I've got, I think, about 10 years of Lectrosonics development in my bag.
Okay. And what lav mics do you like?
So I use both COS-11s and DPA 4061s. I find that the COS-11s actually tend to do well in places with a lot of reverb, where the DPAs are more open, and so like on documentaries where you want to hear more around your subject who's mic'd, they tend to be the better solution.
And what boom mics do you like?
So currently my main two are a DPA 4017B and a Sennheiser MKH-50, but I've also got a Schoeps CMC 641 and an MKH-50.
And timecode boxes.
A couple of the Tentacle Sync E's, and then I actually have three of the first generation Tentacle Syncs that are still going. I think it's been 4 or 5 years, but they seem to work, so still using them. And then I also use a Betso SB-1 that I actually usually keep on me to make sure timecode on all the cameras is still in sync. So I just keep that in my back pocket because it's got the display.
And IFBs? So
my IFBs are a mix of G3 and G2 IEMs, and what I like about those is I think they have a little bit higher sound quality than Comtechs, and they also mean that I can just use one transmitter in my bag instead of having a separate transmitter for camera hops and IFBs. I just use a G3 transmitter out of the TA3 of the 833.
Yeah, speaking of that, let's say, how do you usually have your mixer inputs and outputs set up? Like, what do you put on what channels?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons I really love the 833 compared to the old Sound Devices 633, is that I can reassign those inputs on the fly. So normally I've got boom on channel 1, that's my cabled boom, and then the next 7 channels are my wireless. But a lot of times I've been trying to do more wireless boom work, just because it makes things a lot easier for interview setups when you have to move between multiple setups in a day. I like to go all wireless now, and so I'll usually have that going into input 4, but routed to channel 1.
Okay. And what do you do with your outputs for your IFBs?
So because I've got the one, usually I'm just running the one output of the left channel of the mix to my G3. So I try to feed them whatever sounds best, either the lav or the boom. But then I can cable in, so if I'm doing like a large multicam shoot, I also have a couple of whirlwind boxes to cable directly to up to 6 cameras. And I have sort of one whirlwind box for left, one whirlwind box for right.
Okay, nice. Well, let's talk a little bit about some projects, and one of those I think you did not too long ago, or are currently doing, If You Lived Here. So tell us about that one.
So that is a show for WETA, which is Washington, D.C.'s local PBS station. And I like to refer to it as HGTV with more soul, because the idea is that the hosts tour 3 different houses in different neighborhoods and then try to guess the price. But in between, the show also gives a lot of neighborhood history, and we do interviews with people in the community, both random people on the street, but also community leaders, historians. And I've actually learned a ton about the city and its different neighborhoods through that show. Some of the houses that we cover, some are furnished, some are totally empty. And so I quickly found on that show over the course of season 1 that the COS-11s tend to do a much better job in the empty reverberant houses. They just tend to be more precise, whereas when I was using the DPAs, it sounded just a little bit too echoey. I was surprised at how well the COS-11s handled those reverberant spaces.
And that was one of your first post-COVID shoots?
Yeah, so that was really a lifeline in the summer of 2020 because I hadn't worked really since February. And so that show started in July. And most other shoots had actually been sort of shutting down in that period. And WBTA normally has their own internal team do most of their shows. But because their normal crew had to stay in isolation to cover the conventions that year because it was an election year, WBTA agreed to hire an outside team, which is how I got on board.
All right. You also were a sound mixer on The Problem with Jon Stewart.
I was. That was very, very exciting for me because I've been a Daily Show fan since the early 2000s. So it was like getting to meet one of my heroes to put a microphone on John. It was a little bit of an interesting shoot because they don't like to use booms on the show. So I got in there, I immediately started setting up my boom mics, wired them up to my mixer, and then was told by one of the producers that I should take it all down and basically just go with the lavs. Thankfully, they were very understanding that when you take down the booms, the lavs should be exposed, and they let me do everything I needed to get to sound good, and it sounded great.
Nice. Yeah, I worked with Jon Stewart. It was back in the early 90s on a show called You Wrote It, You Watch It. And I think it was on MTV. And he was such a nice guy. And that was even before he got popular, before he had his show and everything. So he made a lasting impression. Just a friendly guy, shook everybody's hand at the end of the day. And, hey, appreciate everybody. So pretty cool.
So one of the bits of trivia is, so I went to William & Mary for college. And it's actually the same college that Jon Stewart went to. And on the day that we shot The Problem with Jon Stewart, 3 of us were William & Mary alums. So that was that got a laugh out of him when we told him that. His comment was, why did any of you go there? It's not really known as a film school. It's like more government and law and stuff like that.
Cool. You also worked on Kringle Time. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, so one of the ways that I got my start was doing student films with people who were in the film production program at American University. And so that was in the summer, that was starting in 2015 that I was working on those. And a few years later, in 2018, one of my friends from college named Zan Gillies wrote a feature film called Kringle Time, which is sort of the best way I can describe the plot is Death to Smoochie meets Parks and Rec. It's a guy who's been obsessed with this children's show host for much of his life and is actually working on the show, gets the chance to become the children's show character when the original host dies, but finds out that he was only given the role because the host had a dark secret that he wants help covering up. And it was a pretty good movie. It was definitely a kind of grueling shoot. It was about a month. We were pulling some very long days in there. But because it was a movie that I was working on with my friends and written by a friend of mine that I think is very talented and I've enjoyed his work for a long time, it felt really cool to finally sort of break the feature barrier with this group of friends.
Yeah. And you did the post work as well?
I did. So we shot the movie in the summer of 2018, and then in 2020 through the beginning of 2021, I also did the post-sound mix and the sound design for the movie. And that was a kind of humbling experience because it's nobody else to blame when you have sort of the boom bumps into something or there's clothing rustle on the lavs. It was me or my boom operator / sound mixer was helping me out, Matt Blackerby, on that. But it was a very cool experience to try to sort of also see how all of the work that we do gets put together into a feature film.
Yeah, I think more people need to do post with the audio that they recorded on set because, I hear people like, well, they're just going to have to fix it in post. And it's like, well, what if you're the one fixing it in post? So did you learn anything, anything influence you differently on how you record on set now?
And one of the big ones is like how much handling noise is acceptable versus unacceptable. I think wanting to cut down on background hums whenever I have the chance, because that's one of those things I used to like, you can just pull that out with a filter or noise filter when you've got the air conditioning going. It's funny, when I first started, because I taught myself sound in order to do my own short films. And so when I first started, one of my problems was I knew too much about like what you could do in post. And I had to sort of train myself to be like, well, no, people might not have the same kind of experience to pull out background noise. People might not know how to edit around clothing rustle. And then with Kringle Time, it's like I had to relearn, like, okay, no, how do I manage my own, like, what is the best workflow when it is my sound that I've recorded to edit it again? The big one was spending more time to get clothing rustle out of takes, because there are a couple takes where it's like I just sort of was moving fast and was like, well, the person who's editing this is going to have to deal with it. And then that person was me.
Were you doing boom and lavs?
So I was working on that with my friend and fellow sound mixer, Matt Blackerby. He was my boom op on a few days, but then just because we were sort of covering each other so that we could also be working sort of better paid jobs during that month, a lot of times we did end up bagging and booming. And so I did do a lot of sort of one person mixing and booming during that.
All right, so on episode 67, we interviewed Jeremy Zunk, and I think you guys know each other, and you've worked on some projects together.
We do. So Jeremy Zunk is actually one of my main mentors for getting me into sound. I'd been doing it for 2 or 3 years of just working on short films with friends, and it so happened that I was a government contractor before I was a production sound mixer. And I just sort of had left my job because it was kind of a dead-end position. And it just so happened to be 2 weeks before this indie film was filming in the DC area that Jeremy was going to be the mixer for. But he said he would only do it if he got a boom operator or an assistant to help him. And so I interviewed Jeremy at a pizza place over on Capitol Hill. And we liked each other. And basically, I came on board the project. It was called Ladylike. It's a pretty raunchy indie comedy. That's decent, but it was about 3 weeks, and basically it was my trial by fire for getting into this. So I both did a combination of working the mixer. This was my first time working with a Sound Devices 633 and things like Lectrosonics. Previously, I'd been going, like my gear was something like I did have a Sound Devices 302, but I was going into like a Tascam DR40, just like a little 2-channel XLR mixer. And I basically got sort of a masterclass in booming and mixing from Jeremy Zunk over the course of that movie.
That's cool. Now, was there one thing that stood out that was like, excellent, something that you would really take with you?
Oh, I think my proudest moment on that movie was learning how to operate a boom. And this was, again, through Jeremy teaching me about like always keeping my one hand at the end of the boom to make sure you don't hit anybody with it, how to sort of manage the weight when it's fully extended, and like resting it either on your shoulders or your head. My most harrowing moment of that shoot for me was we were in a bar in Georgetown. They actually had me behind the bar booming. There's glass bottles of high-end liquor below me. There's wine glasses hanging by the stem above me, and just learning how to move that boom with precision and not break anything. It was sort of like the culmination of everything I'd learned over the 3 weeks. And got out with no broken glass, so.
You also worked on a show called Violets?
Yeah, so this is an indie film. I'm not sure if it actually came out. This was also my first year of starting, and this was my other main mentor as a sound mixer, although I think he's retired out of the sound mixing game and moved on to theater management. But his name's Matthew Sonnenfeld. So he was actually DPing the project, even though he was largely a sound mixer at that time. So he let me use his gear, which was, again, a 633, along with Wizzycoms. And so that was one early chance for me to sort of experience different types of professional sound gear and also work my head around different workflows, which I still find very useful. Like, one of the things I do now is I try to keep backup bags. So I have a Zoom F8 in a backup bag and a Mix Pre 6 in a backup bag. And if I'm working on a smaller scale shoot that doesn't need all the bells and whistles of the 833, I like to rotate between them just to keep my mind nimble and make sure that I sort of am comfortable with multiple different workflows. One of the things that's been great this year is using the Mix Pre 6 as my field recorder if it's a small documentary shoot with only like 2 microphones. I love that thing. And then my clients have been very happy with it too because it's so well connected with Wingman. So you can really do detailed take notes on the fly. One thing I always tell clients at the start of the day is, hey, if you see me on my phone a lot, I promise I actually am doing it for work and to keep track, and I'll actually show them the Wingman app, and they'll be impressed with that. Oh, going back to the idea of what did I learn from editing my own sound files, one of the big ones is just the importance of track management and file management, making sure your tracks stay consistent. So this was also a big deal. I got to really put this to the test with the show If You Lived Here, of just always keeping the same cast members on the same tracks, and even recording empty tracks if somebody's not there, just because even though it does use up more card space while we're recording, it makes the editor's life, and my life when it came to Kringle Time's case, so much easier when that stuff stayed consistent through the whole project. And so now I try to make a point of, and this is another thing the 833 makes super easy by letting you rearrange which inputs are going to which tracks. You can always keep sort of, even if you have to change microphones or change which receiver a person is going to, you can still keep them on the same track by reassigning those inputs. And that to me has been a game changer.
Yeah. And it's important, like you said, to still keep it armed, because there's times where, back in the day, I'd like turn tracks off and then all of a sudden you didn't realize they need to be recorded and you're like, oh my gosh. And, that track isn't armed and, it's always good, like you said, record some dead air on those tracks.
Well, the other thing is, especially if you're editing in something like Premiere, when you set up like your track mixer, even if a cast member isn't in a scene, having that blank track just so that the poly wave files all line up through the whole project is incredibly useful and saves a ton of time in post than having to sort of manually put that where it needs to go.
Yeah. How was your experience using the Wizzycoms on that one?
It was good. I still am a fan of Lectrosonics more, but I guess this was after the LT and LR had come out from Lectrosonics, but they were also some of the first wideband microphones I'd used. And so that was pretty amazing. I mean, at this point, I was still wrapping my head around the idea of blocks and things. So I just sort of used Sennheiser G3s before this summer, which are very, they're easy to use, but they don't really tell you how they work. Whereas one thing I love about Lectrosonics is the ability to scan frequencies, see that graphical interface. Wizzycoms were sort of a little bit of a mixture between the two, where they just had such a wide range of channels you could pick from, but I did miss that Lectrosonics graphical interface with them. That said, they're very good microphones, and the sound quality is fantastic on them.
Yeah, I have some Wizzycoms as well, and I really like them, and I have Lectrosonics. They were a little bit less expensive than my Lectros, but I needed some additional mics, so I got those. But they're good.
Well, one of the things that gives me gear acquisition syndrome is that 4-channel Wizzycom receiver. It's very tempting. I think I'm a Lectro fanatic through and through, but packing 4 channels into one SRB-sized receiver is a pretty fantastic accomplishment. I actually did get a chance on a home renovation show to use. This was another sound mixer was providing the kit, so I got a chance to use it's the MCR 54, and in an SL2 as well. And I'd be curious what it's like to use them without the SL2, because I can imagine that might be a little intimidating. With the SL2, I was amazed at how easy it was to change frequencies and coordinate everything, and it was very smooth.
Yeah, to see the scan function on your, on the 833 in the window, that's great. Because those screens really are small.
Yeah.
Even for the Lectros, they're still tiny, but I think even on the Wizzies, they're even smaller than that. But, it works good.
Yeah, I don't think I'd want to go smaller than an SRB when it comes to reading information. So it definitely pairs well with the SL2.
All right, I was looking way back, and it says that you were an English teacher in the Ukraine back in the day.
I was. Right after I graduated college, I used to teach English in Luhansk Oblast, which is in the Far East, as a Peace Corps volunteer from 2009 to 2011.
And I know we don't get real political on this podcast, but what are your thoughts on what's going on over there?
It's a really scary and bad situation right now. I've actually been reaching out to some of my former students. It's been hard to get in touch with the ones who still live in Luhansk Oblast, because right now that's under Russian occupation. My students that are living in Europe and elsewhere abroad are really upset. It's a very scary situation. I know kids who were basically sheltering in the Kyiv subway system up until this week.
I hope it's over sooner rather than later.
Yeah, same here. And just hoping that there is a peaceful resolution to the end. And that's not really a possibility at this point. But I do think it's been inspiring to see the world's response to it, to see the outpouring of support in support of Ukraine and the amount of aid. So I went to a volunteering like a volunteer drive last weekend where we were packing boxes of aid, and just the amount of donations that had come in was really inspiring. And I was really glad to see that and be able to be a part of that.
Yeah, that's good. Were you already thinking about being in the film industry when you were there, or is that something that came later?
I've always wanted to make movies since I was in middle school or high school. So I would make not very good movies in middle school and high school. But like through college, I had a group of friends that we would make usually like time competitions. So I cut my teeth. William and Mary does one called 24 Speed, where you write, shoot, and edit a movie in 24 hours. Actually, the very first one I did was Apple's Insomnia Contest, which only ran for 2 years, I think, which is also a 24-hour contest. And then I've done a few 48-hour film projects as well. It was actually on those 48-hour film projects that I really learned how to do sound, because I had trouble finding somebody else to do sound for me. I also knew very early on that what separates a watchable movie from an unwatchable movie is often the sound quality. Because if you have something that's very dialogue heavy, but you can't hear any of the dialogue, or the dialogue is painful to listen to, nobody's going to want to watch that movie. And so I sort of started learning sound and like picked up the Tascam recorder and the Sound Devices 302 to sort of up my own game for those short films. And then realized that a lot of other people have that problem of not being able to find a sound mixer too, and decided to make it a profession. And thankfully I've been lucky enough to still be doing it 7 years later.
Yeah. Well, what's your favorite type of project to do?
So around DC, our main ones are documentary and corporate videos. I love documentaries. I love learning about the world. For example, last December, I got really lucky, and I had one golden week where the first 2 days were on artificial intelligence and nuclear weapons, and then the next 2 days were on ransomware and cybercrime, which are all just like fun topics to learn a bunch about. And I feel really privileged to be able to sort of have the voices of experts in my ears on all these different topics. I mean, you have to remember to like stay focused on like, okay, was there background noise? Did you just hear that bus? Is there a plane going through right now? But I feel like I've really been able to learn quite a bit from this job. That said, my passion is probably narrative projects. I got into filmmaking to tell stories. And so one of the things that I love to work on, but don't get nearly as many opportunities as I'd like, is working on narratives and projects with good story. Like one of the things when people reach out about short films or indie films, my first question is always like, send me the script. Like I want to see, because if it's a good story, like I understand that there might not be as much money in the budget for it, especially around DC. Almost everything is independently financed or self-financed. One of the things I like about DC is that it is a very scrappy filmmaking community. So there's a lot of people that will get their friends together to make a movie, and some of them have really good stories to tell. And so I'm always down to help them out, but I want to see that script first, because to me that's the most important thing about whether or not I want to get involved.
Yeah, I just wrapped on it was a short film project, and it was good. It was like, and it's going to be a tearjerker. And this director, writer that I've done a couple projects with her, and she knows how to tell a story. It's one of those positive kind of feel good kind of things, and as well as making a statement when you do it. So it was a lot of fun.
Wait, so what's that called, if you don't mind me asking?
It's in post now, but it's called Dance for Me. It's a pleasure working with a good group of people too. Everybody. I met a lot of new people on this one, and some older folks that I've worked with in the past as well. So,
well, that's been one of the interesting things here, is because people don't think of DC as a big film town when it comes to narrative, and to an extent they're right. Although we do have a pretty good film history, and we do have some local projects. Like we had House of Cards for a long time. A lot of movies will come to film their sort of government shots in DC, so we do have movies come through here pretty frequently. But we actually do have a pretty active and scrappy indie community here. And a lot of them are people really like at the very beginning of their filmmaking lives. So sometimes it's very low budget. It's like, okay, you need some work, but this is how the only way you get better is by practice and making. And so we have a tendency of like when people do actually start to really get better at making movies, they tend to like move away to New York, LA, Atlanta. But it's been neat to see how that sort of cycles. Like I said, I started working with students in American University's graduate program in 2015, and a bunch of them have sort of moved on to other cities and moved on to other jobs. But now we're starting to get sort of like the new crop now, 7 years later, coming in. And it's really cool to see sort of our upcoming filmmakers taking the spots and sort of starting the cycle again.
And you see people with the passion to be, want to tell these stories. So it's always a pleasure. I love doing that stuff.
Well, I think that's something that's sometimes underappreciated when it comes to indie films is how important that the community of people that make them are, because there's not a ton of money in it for the most part. And so you are sort of doing it for the love of filmmaking, for the love of the game. And that's been something that's been very interesting over the past couple of years coming out of COVID and just sort of getting back into it. And also we're starting to work with new people, is how, like, when there is that spirit of collaboration and cooperation among all the different departments, like, it really, really matters on indie film sets. So, like, it's been interesting because, like, there's some people that will get a little bit mean on set or will get a little snappy with people. And it just is like, or one of the things that does bug me on short indie films is when people want things to be as precise as they are on, like, high-end commercial projects. And that's good if it means being efficient and getting the job done. But if you're just sort of doing it because you want that hierarchy, that's not great. Whereas, because then I like to think of it more as like we're in this together. We're sort of all working towards the same goal of making the best possible movie we can. And so let's drop some of that pretense.
Yeah. And let's have fun doing it. You know, I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, we need to be professional. Yeah, we need to do our jobs, but let this be a positive, fun project to work on. And it starts from the top. So if you have a grumpy, I mean, I've been on some where you have a grumpy DP and he set the tone for the entire crew. And it's like everybody was walking on eggshells because you don't want to upset anybody.
Well, I didn't want to throw the DPs under the bus, but that's usually who it is. No, because I had that on a short film recently where the DP was very precise but not very communicative, and like he would get upset with you. He's like, "Hey, sound, like, tell me when you're rolling. Tell me when you're rolling." And then I would tell him, like, "All right, sound speed." He's like, "Oh, I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet." And just like everybody needs to chill out a little bit. I mean, that said, I've had lots of really good experiences on set, and one thing I do like about the DC area is because we are a little bit scrappier, and we do tend to have smaller teams. Even pre-COVID, we had a lot of small documentary teams. Like, I've had DP friends who will offer to, like, help me move my bag around. I offer to help them set up lights. And so we do have, I know that gets joked about on a lot of larger sets, and in those cases, it is important to sort of stay in your lane. But when it is just like a 4-person team or a 3-person team of, like, producer, DP, sound, it helps to have all hands on deck. And one of the things I'm most happy with in DC is how there is this sort of general spirit of goodwill, and we all recognize that, like, we're in it to do the job well.
Yeah. You know, I was working on it. It was a corporate video, and we were at this hotel, and we were in the lobby, and they moved some lights over and C-stands, but the sandbag was like right in the middle of the walkway. So I just went over and picked it up and walked it and put it on the stand, and the guy was like, "Oh my gosh," he said, "a sound man moving a sandbag happens like never." And I said, "I'm just trying to help out." And he goes, No, I appreciate it. So I thought, that's a shame.
Well, it's weird because I think one of the things that's interesting with film is how there are so many different worlds when it comes to film. Because if you're on sort of a larger commercial set or even a large, like, a union set, like, there are really specific lanes, and it does matter that sort of, like, don't touch the grip department stuff because they need to know exactly where that stuff is. Like, don't touch the camera department stuff, just like we don't want the camera department to touch the sound department stuff. Then when you're on a smaller set, I think it helps to be flexible and help out and have sort of that team spirit.
All right, well, tell us your worst on-set experience.
My worst on-set experience was a commercial for mattresses, of all things, and it ran for 18 hours because the director basically had planned this incredibly overly ambitious day. It should have been a 2-day shoot from the beginning, but was trying to get it supposedly in a 10-hour day. He wasn't satisfied with the color of the walls, and so we literally had to stop and repaint the walls and sit there watching paint dry for 2 hours twice over the course. And by the end of the 18 hours, our main actor was kind of having a, like, mental breakdown. Like, I actually had fun with it. I just sort of went and started recording different sounds for, like, sound effects just in my downtime. And then the best part was after the shoot was over, the director, who was also the producer on that project, didn't want to pay overtime, even though he had gone 8 hours over schedule. And so that's the one time I've actually had to get into a fight with somebody over getting paid. Knock on wood.
Man. Well, if you could offer advice to people getting started in the industry, what kind of encouragement would you give them?
I think one of the biggest lessons that I had to learn was especially when you're first starting out, you want to communicate sort of how much you know and that you know what you're doing. And so I had definitely had a tendency to over communicate like what I was dealing with when I'm coping with a sound problem on set. So telling producers, oh, like I've got to adjust frequencies because I'm getting some RF interference. It's like that's probably going right over their head or getting a blank look. And you're also like, they're not sure if they should be understanding what you're saying or not. And so just telling them what they really care about is how much time is it going to take to solve this problem. And so just being like, hey, I need 2 minutes, got to change a setting. Or, hey, I need a minute, I got to adjust the placement of the mic. And just giving people quick, simple explanations. And have the reasoning why you need that time ready in case they push back and be like, oh no, we don't have time for this. Be like, well, your audio is going to sound scratchy if you don't give me 2 minutes, I can fix it. One thing that was also really hard though is when you're just starting out, you're not sure how much time it's going to take to solve a problem. And so basically the old line from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, don't panic. Most problems are solvable, and just give yourself a little bit of extra time to work on it. And sort of even when people are breathing down your neck, actually one of the sound mixers on Real Housewives of Potomac that I worked with, Adam Howell, has a really good line about this. Like the perfect state of mind for a sound mixer is controlled panic. Because if you're not panicking, you're probably forgetting something important and everything's going to fall apart. But you don't want to just be sort of panicking wildly and uncontrollably. It should be controlled panic, because then you still are managing the situation. You're still confidently addressing the problem. You're going to get through the day.
Nice. Yeah, you're screaming on the inside as you solve the problem.
Yeah. And one thing is just that know that a lot of that stress as you get more experience does go away. So when you're dealing with a rustling lav in your first year, it can be very scary because you're not quite sure how you're going to solve that problem. And then it also helps to experiment like on your off time. Like I do a ton of just sort of messing around with my gear on my days off just to get a sense of it. The other big one is don't be afraid to sort of mention if you have problems. Like if a lav is rustling, address it, because they're really people want good sound for their project, even if it doesn't feel that way in the moment. Like another great line that my friend Matt Blackerby told me was, hate me now, love me later. So it really does help. I mean, you never want to be the one holding stuff up, but at the same time, a few seconds on set can oftentimes save minutes or hours in post.
Exactly. Yeah, the first AD on this one project I worked on, she was great. You know, the take would finish, she'd turn to me, she'd go, sound? You know, and we'd get the thumbs up, or I'd say, I need another one and I need to adjust that mic. And they were really good about that. So not always the case, but it was nice to have that.
It's good that she kind of turns to you and asks for sound, but I think one thing that's also valuable and important is basically letting people finish their sentences before you interrupt to say if there's a sound problem. So like that's a good working relationship that you had with that AD, because she knows to check in with you at the end of the take, and not just because you haven't said anything doesn't mean that there wasn't something to say or something that should be said again. Because a lot of times our interview subjects or whoever or actors in a scene are sort of in the moment of it, and you don't want to blow up that moment or blow up their train of thought or blow up their line of thinking and what they're saying. And the other thing is that somebody in post might be able to use that soundbite even if there was a plane going overhead or a bus in the background or somebody laughing in the distance. But if you interrupt them, they definitely can't use it.
Exactly. What was your favorite audio you've recorded so far?
So I did some work for a group called Nitro Circus, which is like extreme sports, like skateboarding, stunt bikes, and they also do like ATVs. This is like at a place in Maryland. They have like an extreme sports track, like just sort of out in the woods. And so they were driving this thing called a Razor, which is sort of like an ATV, but with a full roll cage around it. And they're doing laps of this course with like jumps and things. And this thing would like go completely over, would roll multiple times. I'm really amazed nobody got killed that day. But they asked me to record the people in the car. And so I didn't want to put my bag in there because I was pretty sure anything I put in that car was going to get destroyed. So what I did was I hooked one of my old G3 lavs to a Zoom H1 recorder that I stuffed inside my dead cat and then stuffed that into the glove box of the Razor ATV, ran the wire out of the glove box up the roll cage right between the two people in the ATV, and they flipped that thing a record number of, I think they flipped 13 times, including like a 30-foot jump where they landed upside down. But when the ATV came back around the track, the lav was intact. My H1 still works, still have it to this day. And that audio is 10 minutes of just some of the greatest like screams, and just it was a pretty fun time.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's great when you do something like that. Your gear is safe. You got good audio. Can't beat it.
Yeah.
Well, if people wanted to connect with you online, what's the best way to do that?
Probably the easiest way is through Instagram, where I am at #cats. So it's hashtagged the word past tense _cats, which just started as a joke about 5 or 6 years ago because I started adding #cats to all my Instagram posts because I figured I'd get a lot more views that way, and it actually has kind of worked. And then you can also reach me at ted.hogeman@gmail.com.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I want to say thanks to Ted Hogeman for being on the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
And I'd like to say thanks to everyone for listening. If you have questions or would like us to discuss a particular topic, email us at locationsoundpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, remember, sound is half the picture.